Hello guys, Zanaka here, and thought I'd make a quick video. Just got a bit of downtime since after QuakeCon. This video would actually be called the fastest way to improve. Now, obviously it's very controversial. I'm sure there's many different ways or people would think to improve, but I just kind of got this idea because I really think that, I think it's true. I think it works. I'll first off start by saying this quote that I've heard before. Which is, if you don't define your reality, the world defines your reality. And in essence, what that means, besides the obvious fact, is that, if you don't tell yourself, if you don't have a direction, then essentially whatever other people say or whatever other people say or what you hear is basically how you define yourself. Now, obviously you can get yourself in trouble with that because, for example, let's say in the world of Quake or the world of video games, someone says you have a bad aim, bad confidence, bad map control. Well, you may have a different opinion to that, but you're trying to define what that reality is for you. Now, oftentimes what we would do is, when we're practicing, is we think that, okay, all we need to do is get in the game, mindlessly play, and, we're going to get there. Kind of works to an extent, but I think you kind of run into some problems, and I think that's some of the issues that I've kind of run into as you kind of get to this final stage, if I can say it like that, even for myself, getting to that world champion level. So I'll start off with the points, and we'll go through them together. There's four pros and four cons. Four things you can do, rather. So 4 things you can do. Write down the objective. The second one, review what other pros do and their strengths. How did they do it and why? The third is humility, to be humble when you're reviewing these things. And fourth one, which I think is actually quite important for me, is do one thing at a time. And I think for a lot of people that play video games are always on the computer, especially these days, computers are so quick and do so many things at once. It's not really ideal. You want to do one thing at one time. Okay, the negatives. Varied results when you're not really focusing on what you're doing. You have, in this second one, automatic and same responses, so you keep doing the same thing because you're not actually aware of what you're doing. You're just doing the same behavior every single day. 3, developing bad habits, of course, because you have those same responses and it is automatic. And the fourth one, it's just inefficient. There's a way we can get this practice to be better and to be good. So, start with the first one of why it's good. So when you're writing down the objective, define who and what it is. So obviously, when you're playing, you're gonna have some start point. You're gonna say to yourself, well, I want to get better LG. Then you start looking at, okay, well, what defines what a good LG is? Now, as you can see, as we're already getting into, as we're even just starting it, you're starting to see that you have to be quite clinical in what you're trying to express. I think the most important thing there is to be specific with the details, because if you're not specific, that goes back into the other point about it before, where, well, what defines a good LG? A good LG could be someone with 15% LG. It's all relative in some sense. But then I guess compared to others who have higher percentages, then you could ask yourself, well, what are they doing specifically? And a lot of the time there is a reason for that. Sometimes maybe it is genetic and they're just very good at being able to reactively shoot or something like that. But a lot of the time it's more of a physical and material sense. It's position. It's how they're holding the mouse, what type of reactions they're having while they're actually using the mouse. Is that something that is repeatable that you can do? So again, in a more blank way to define it is define who and what it is. What are you trying to achieve? And the little second point I have for that is be conscious about the focus on the topic. Is as you're engaging in the practice of whatever you're trying to achieve there, you're constantly addressing and you're really trying to identify what is happening in those moments each time. Because again, if you go into that reactive and not mindful type of way of playing, what you're going to do is you'll get the LG out, if there's an example of improving LG, and you won't make the adjustments. You'll just keep doing what the first thought in your head is, which is to just keep engaging with that. And like I said, sometimes that actually does work, but oftentimes, it's because you're thinking about other things. You're not focusing on the topic, and in essence, it kind of leads to that slow and inefficient process. Okay, point 2. Review other pros and their strengths. How do they do it and why? Okay. And the little sub point that I have there is, if you don't look, you won't find. And again, maybe seems obvious enough, but that's really funny with a lot of these ideas. It's like, it's the fact that it's the simple things, or it's the simple process of finding them. Anyway, so when you're looking at the other pros, what you can do with that is, what you have to remember is that in the great plethora of information that's out there, right? So you have your physical experience about how you interpret information, how you look at information, but yet there is, like, let's say if you're in the pro league and you have the 15 other players who all play, and what they do, they all have thousands of hours of what they're also been doing as well, which they've all also perfected their strengths in their particular way. What better way to just save yourself thousands of hours based on what they've done, to be able to kind of see which moments they're kind of peaking, or even moments where they're also weak too, and finding out like what the benefit is there. Okay, third point, which is to be humble, or to have humility. Why that's important. If you think a thought that's not conducive to success or positivity, reframe and readjust. So for example, that's a way of thinking of your own thoughts or your own perception. Is it, if you're going into a game and you almost have this type of arrogance, I'd be really careful with something like arrogance, for example. Because you can have confidence in your ability, and that will also take you far. But I think sometimes arrogance can cause a problem where, if the other guy does trump you in a situation like that, your brain does this thing where a reality of what you thought was going to happen didn't happen. And that's when it gets that confusion, frustration, because something you believe so real to be true, it isn't. And then you're having to kind of readjust from that. Whereas humility is going to be able to say, my opponent has moments where he's going to be strong. I'm not saying there will be, but there might be moments where you might die in a game of Quake, geez. And then in that sense, you're, again, rethinking the thoughts. Okay, I have strong LG, and there are moments where I'm strong in this game. And when you're doing that, all of a sudden you don't have that, you're not setting that program up in your head to let yourself down. You're going to be like consistently playing well throughout the entire game. At least that's the idea. Okay, and the fourth point, which I really think is quite powerful, is do one thing at a time. I think a large part of what really messes people up, especially like on the computer, is that they're constantly trying to do too many things at one time. When you're defining your goals, when you're defining your reality, it's so important to understand how it all fits in together. Because if you're kind of just like taken by the whim of the moment, someone's invites you to a party one evening and you just say, yep, I'll go. It's like, sometimes that can also be good. You can have a level of spontaneity and that's fine. But if there's no sense of, okay, I do this event, which then leads to X amount of decisions which will happen later, which impact those decisions. And if you don't think about the decisions or how you're doing things, that's how you end up in this mess. Because you're like, well, how did I end up here? Well, it's because you did things that you didn't necessarily want to do. Because if you clearly defined what those things were, you wouldn't be doing them. So that was one example of how that'll, like, not to distract yourself, but essentially I've heard this before and I Googled it just then, which was, what's the level of how much cognitive function do you lose when you actually flick between things? Let's say you go from Quake to YouTube to Twitter to YouTube back to streaming. Apparently it's like 20% per task. So for example, if you're streaming, for example, you're having to worry about, talking to the chat or managing the stream, let alone trying to focus on the play. That's already going to take an element of that. Or if you're like practicing yourself and you'll flick and you'll see who's streaming, or you go on YouTube or Twitter. I don't do that as much, but I have done that in the past, and I have to really quite even take control of myself when I do that. And yeah, and I noticed that as soon as I structure the day, so to speak, and be more purposeful with it, you're much more productive with that. I'll go through the negative points, but I think we kind of went through the main meat of what this video is all about. But here are some of the downfalls of when you're not mindful about what you're doing. Okay, so first one, varied results. Not knowing what the results mean because it's not constructed in your mind. That totally makes sense for me, right? Because if you're playing and something happens in the game, but because you're unfocused, you don't even understand what the stimulus was. If you're focusing on particular things, you're going to be looking for how the situation is in your mind. You could say we passively learn, and to some extent we do kind of passively learn. But if you're very aware about, okay, if my opponent attacks in this way, and these are the conditions, and this is the stack, and this is the position, how did the game go? Your brain's going to have a much better opportunity to remember that fact. And that's how you kind of have to get this optimized learning, because instead of just playing and, oh yeah, this is a moment that kind of pissed me off, I'll try to remember that next time. Whereas you're remembering specific moments, and ideally that will be kind of back into your mind. And again, you're focusing on the things that create a great game, a great game of Quake. Okay, second negative point, automatic and same responses, equivalent to hitting your head against a wall. Again, that kind of gets back into that when you're not being mindful, doing the same thing all the time, not really thinking about what you're doing, and ultimately sometimes that can be good because you're shutting down that part of your brain to focus on other things, if you are focusing on other things. But a lot of the time, if the result in the game is not what you want, then obviously there's some level of focus you need to put there to change it. Otherwise, you're just going to keep doing the same behavior, or as life kind of does to us, it hits you so hard in some moments of so much pain that you finally do actually do something about it, and that's what the pain type of pain is there. Third point, developing bad habits, trying to get the task over with. One thing that can happen when you're not being mindful, if you're not being mindful and you're uncomfortable about something, so let's say there's a stress that you don't want that you're currently experiencing right now, what your brain will do is it'll purposely just try to get the situation over with, right? So until you clearly define, let's say that you want to go for a goal as being world champion, you want to be the best player. If you're not willing to go through the moments where there'll be tension, or you can even notice it. I mean, it happened in my games. I've seen in other people's games too, where there'll kind of be a moment of contention, and then you kind of lose that contention, and then suddenly you just want it to be over with because you've kind of become demotivated. It's a reality that almost happened but didn't happen, and now you've lost your chance and you didn't take it. There's a couple elements to that, right? You could also say, the ability to close it out or the ability to handle the stress. I think both those things are important there. But the point I'm trying to make is constantly be focused on what you're trying to achieve in this moment, because if you've got other things in the back of your head that you need doing that you're not doing, then the reason why you're rushing through the game is more than likely is because unconsciously, whether you realize it or not, I need to get this over with because I've got other shit I need to do. So you'll end up just pushing, rushing. And, I often say to people that I think a lot of elements, not just in Quake, but in life, very rarely, I think, is it about your intelligence, but is it more your capacity to not be stressed when interpreting the information? A large part of the time, and you probably notice it for yourself, is like, how is it that when you play the game, you have a different response, but then when you watch the VOD, you clearly see what your mistake was. So it's an emotional response. Okay, well then you have to say to yourself, why am I emotionally responding here? And you can go back and address within yourself limiting beliefs. Just be brutally honest. At the end of the day, you could do this by yourself, do it with a friend that you trust, and with writing it down. And then ideally, you can go back into that moment and you can have a different perspective. Then instead of being stressed, you can capitalize in those moments. The last point is being inefficient. If you're being inefficient with your time, I mean, I think you can kind of drive yourself a bit crazy with that one, because then you can say, well, what is efficiency, what's not, and what's defined as good. But try to, with your own information you have at the present time, do your best with that information, and then start to unravel it to make it better. If you end up going through life and doing nothing, well, that's always sometimes it can be a sad way to do it, because you don't really get too far, I think, with that. But if you do, even with this video, for example, I've kind of just taken the whim that I'm going to make it this way, wrote down my little points. Maybe it's too long, maybe it's too short, I don't know. But we're going to go with it, then readdress what we can do better there and make it better for the next one. So that's kind of how, very similar type of approach, and being optimistic that, all right, how's it going to go this time? And kind of, as Jordan Peterson, I really like what he says, trying to just have fun with the task at hand, or whatever you're doing, actually, to have fun with the task, and ultimately, creative child kind of comes out to play with that. All right, guys, that's probably be it. I hope you enjoyed that one. Let me know what you think. And like I said, I really think a big thing for me that I found was when I first came to Poland, it was very much like just playing a lot and trying to getting the hours in. But now the closer that I've kind of gotten to the top, the more I've needed to realize that it's not just, well, clearly it's not just hours put into the game, but it's defining what are the moments that you're missing or could improve on, and just being more mindful with your time. And not only do you get better quicker, but I think yeah, well, I've been having more fun with it, because suddenly, instead of just give it to me, I just want to know what the answer is, you're kind of actually able to use your creative process to, then you can find it for yourself, and that's quite fun. All right, guys, thank you for watching, and talk to you guys soon.